So let's settle in and let's begin this journey together. Today's learning objectives will be around understanding the history and development of IFS, exploring the concept of parts. We'll be examining and describing the different components that make the self in IFS, including the ACs and the 5Ps. I will also be covering the concept of self-energy and what that is, what that looks like. And we'll be identifying the primary goals of IFS. And then I will have some Q&A time. And throughout the lecture, again, you can ask questions in the chat. So let's start off with the history. Let's maybe do a quick diving into how this started. And I'm pretty sure if you're coming to this workshop, you've seen this face, and this is Richard Schwartz, Dick. He's the developer and pioneer of this model. He earned his PhD in marriage and family therapy from Purdue University. Dick developed his foundational work with IFS in the early 80s after he noticed that his clients were made up of many different pieces at the time. He didn't have the language, so that's where, all the parts language comes from. And then he noticed that people also had this core essence, which he then called or named the self. Then the theory of multiplicity of mind kind of like began right after that. And in 1995, IFS was fully developed with the publication of his first book, Internal Family Systems. And later on in the early 2000s, he founded the IFS Institute. Back then, it was called the Self-Leadership Institute. And I believe in 2019, it got changed to the IFS Institute. So if you want to remember something about the history of IFS, is that this concept or this model borrows many different concepts from other modalities, meaning other psychotherapeutic models. And in family or system theory, family therapy, we have any different other models. So Dick borrowed from structural family therapy, narrative and Bowenian family therapy, and strategic family therapy. IFS also has this component of mindfulness in Buddhism and Gestalt therapy, as well as psychodynamic and psychoanalytic concepts. So Dick borrowed from all of these different models, and then he came up with his own theory. That was how IFS was created. It wasn't until 2013, from a longitudinal randomized controlled trial study that involved 70 individuals in a 36 weeks IFS treatment who suffer from chronic rheumatoid arthritis pain and persistent depression, that IFS kind of gained this big reputation. That study put IFS on the map, literally, because it showed that pain and depression were able to be reduced and treated using the model. So in 2015, the US Government Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, SAMHSA, recognized IFS as an effective for improving general functioning and well-being, improving phobias, panic, and generalized anxiety disorder symptoms. It also stated that physical health conditions and symptoms were improved, personal resilience, self-concept, and depressive symptoms. In that same year, SAMHSA established IFS as a model in the National Registry for Evidence-Based Programs. And that's what led to IFS now being an evidence-based model, and what put IFS on the globe, because now it's a highly renowned model globally. Here's some basic assumptions about the model and the practice. IFS carries this big assumption that everyone has a self. We all have a self. We all have a core. The mind is subdivided into an indeterminate number of subpersonalities, or what Dick named parts. There are no bad parts. The non-extreme intentions of each part is something positive for the individual. And in our own lifespan and childhood experiences, internal parts developed and form a very complex system of interaction among themselves. So each part has its own memories, thoughts, behaviors, motivations, and feelings. This is very important to remember. Changes in the internal system will affect changes in the external system. How we relate to our parts internally will then show how we relate to other people and other people's parts externally. I want to pause quickly here, just a quick brief pause, see if there are any questions about the history and the theory before I transition to parts. So let's go into this overview of parts, and parts are subdivided into two different major categories: protected parts and wounded part. And the protected parts are managers and firefighters, and the wounded parts are called exiles. So in this category of managers, we have those protective and proactive parts. And managers are basically the gatekeepers holding the key to the inner system. And I just want you to imagine kind of like a bouncer ready to kick out any visitor they think won't respect their authority. So when you go to, let's say, a club or a bar or somewhere that there's a bouncer right at the door, that's your manager. And if you're not respecting their authority, they're not going to let you in. They're going to kick you out. Managers are proactive parts. They run our day-to-day routines and are more socially accepted and are shaped by our society here. They are experienced as tension, pain, breath constriction, and sometimes muscle tension in the body. I'm not sure, like, if you've heard people, well, I have this neck pain here or shoulder pain. Often like when I talk to clients in my practice, they come in with a lot of heaviness on their shoulder. And those sometimes are their managers that have been so overly worked that now it's showing somatically in their bodies. They take on beliefs and values and biases that help a person fit in. And a good example about this is like people pleasing, perfectionism, hard worker. So you can already connect how managers get these stories and beliefs from society. You need to be a hard worker. You need to be nice. You need to be a good girl. You need to be a good boy. They are experienced when people try to control their environments, please and take care of others, try to be perfect, passive, shut down, self-criticize, judge, denied, and or avoid. So those are kind of like the main characteristics of managers. Now you might be asking yourselves, how do I work with those parts? What are the primary goals? And you'll notice that the primary goal in IFS to work with the protective system or protective parts is to build self to part relationship. And that helps us in increase trust from the part to the self. And I'll go more into what that looks like once I address direct access and other techniques later on in the lecture. But just for now, think about building a self to part relationship. And how do we do that? We do that by hearing and not judging the manager, hearing what they have to say, hearing their story, what they do for the person, for the system. We share respect and share validation and tell them that we do consider them in the system. We include them. There's space here for you. And so they don't feel excluded. And we appreciate them. We demonstrate that what they do for our clients or for us is needed and their job is appreciated. Our main goal is to help manager parts let go of their extreme roles and to kind of shift into more of a non-extreme role. And that takes work, but that is one of the main goals here. And when you're working with managers, we want to help the client's inner family become more harmonious, more balanced, more clear, more centered. Now, how do these parts show? So managers show differently than the other parts. The way that managers show is more controlling and taking control of spaces and environments. Okay. Managers stepped in preemptively in situations as a way to minimize the activation of exiles. So think about these parts as the ones that show up first, and then when they're too tired, then they pass the baton to firefighters. And sometimes they don't, but firefighters just come in. But for now, let's focus on managers. How do they show up? They show preemptively. They do this in many different ways, such as controlling environment in the body physically, striving, achieving, overcompensating to be seen as a good person, perfectionism, holding standards or rules to live by, risk avoidance, concern for safety, evaluating, analyzing, criticizing, judging yourself internally and others, caretaking of others, pleasing others, worrying, scanning for problems or missteps. Have you heard people say, I need to scan the room before I say anything? I need to scan the room. I need to feel what's in the room. So that's their manager speaking. So maybe that room is not safe enough for them to be in there. Denying problems or significance of history, passive pessimism or passive aggressiveness, blocking or numbing as a way of life. When you avoid, you blocked, you numb, rejecting any part that others reject or shame. So within ourselves, when we present ourselves to people, they might not like some parts of us, and they might let us know that through their reactions physically or verbally. So your managers get that message. So what they do internally, they look at those parts and they isolate them, they put them away. So that's the work that managers do. So they're really hard workers, you know. I just want to show this picture here because I feel like it illustrates, you know, like kind of like a day-to-day life experience of a manager and how it shows. So this is Tom. He works in administration. He has an analyzer part. At work, he can be very analytical. He likes to think of alternative ways of doing things and can be a good problem solver. Sometimes he is hard on himself. He criticizes himself heavily and blames himself for others' work mistakes. This is his inner critic. Other times, he likes to be silly and enjoys playing jokes on his colleagues, and that's more of his joker part. So you can see the dynamic here. Within one person, you can have multiple managers doing multiple different jobs at the same time. And this can happen all simultaneously, or so I just want to kind of like stop here for 1 second to gauge questions about managers. And yeah, let's bring us back here. So these parts are protective. Again, we're with the set of protective parts, but this one are more reactive. They're reactive, single-minded, and strong. I want you to think about a real life firefighter. They, when there's a fire, they come in, they don't ask to be let in the house. They just rush through it because they're trying to push the fire down. So just picture that. There's a lot of going on inside of that house. The fire is flaming. So they just That's their job, to put down the fire. They're not concerned about any collateral damage. They react immediately to protect and rescue the system from flooding and the overwhelming feelings from vulnerable parts, which are the exiles. This happens often when there's no manager available. You will often find a firefighter doing that job in that space. And then they can co work together, but it's often like a firefighter doing the job to again keep the exile from that space. Extreme firefighters that hijack the system are often feared and intensely disliked managers. Okay. And society. Good example of this is, like when people go on manic episodes and they do a lot of stuff like drinking, using substances. They do a lot of self-harm. So that is a good example of firefighting or a firefighter taking the lead in that internal system of that person. They are judged, right, by society because if you are a person who is doing all of these behaviors, then you're judged by society and they are criticized and judged by the internal managers as well because they are labeled as destructive and selfish. But again, they're only trying to make the person feel better. Firefighters' goal is to keep the exiles' pain away by one, distracting or getting rid of their feelings. Now, the goals that we should have with these parts when we're working with it, firefighter parts, should be around, again, building self-to-part relationship, more specifically increasing the firefighter trust in the client's self, helping them acknowledge that their role is not working as intended. And you do that through validation, but maybe providing a reframe, providing an example of what other roles would you like to do instead of this one? Because this one is not working as intended. We want to help the firefighter let go of its extreme role and shift into a non-extreme role. Provide hope to these parts by helping them see other ways to do their jobs or let go of their current job. And again, that takes work, that takes time. Finally, increase internal harmony and balance. So you can see that the goals are somewhat similar, but firefighters, in my experience, in my clinical experience, you have to be very gentle with them because just like managers, they're not always ready to let go of their roles. How do these parts show? They disinhibit and behave reactively in situations to minimize activation of exiles. They show as defensive or aggressive when the system feels under attack. They help in distracting and escaping pain by altering states with substances, activity, or some other type of diversion. They actually help people deal with uncomfortable feelings by, again, using humor or by shutting down. So a joker part, as we saw earlier in Tom's case, that was probably a firefighter that was co-working with the two manager parts that were in that case. So again, managers and firefighters can be present at the same time and they can coexist. These parts are rebellious against controlling parts. So again, they have this other opposite relationship with the managers. And that's what we try to work on, try to get them to have a better relationship with each other. They lead people to engage in behaviors that harm the body or relationships by making individuals feel out of control, addicted, hostile, sneaky, insensitive, and compulsive. They often are experienced in the body as anxiety, panic, hypervigilance, pains, cravings, and impulses. So here's another example. So Karen lives with her husband. She often feels controlled and not cared for in her marriage. Sometimes she worries her husband will leave. It has an angry manager part that often pushes people away with anger when she doesn't feel safe. Keeping people at a distance can prevent fears of abandonment and possible hurt by others. She has a worry manager part. This part attempts to think through problem and attempt to control and avoid future difficulties. When she feels especially vulnerable and scared, she has a self-harm firefighter that tries to distract her from her emotional distress from feeling abandoned. Let me make a quick stop here. So those are managers and firefighters. Now let's go into exiles, and these are wounded parts. Okay, think about pain, childhood experiences, young parts that have experienced trauma, attachment injuries, devaluating experiences. And from these experiences, they have become burdened. And you'll hear that word quite often in this IFS language because we try to help exile parts unburden, release their burdens. Exiles are hidden and kept out of awareness. Think about a dungeon, think about a basement. That's where they live for the most part. And the parts that do that job, that put them in the dungeon, are your managers and firefighter parts. They can be increasingly extreme and desperate in an effort to be cared for, to be healed, and to have their stories told. Um, so they just want to show up, but they carry so much energy that that amount of energy kind of like threatens the system and the protected parts. So that's why those protected parts then send them back into the dungeon, into that basement, into that dark space. These parts hold sensations and feelings and memories of the maybe painful events. Um, and most of the time, they are always stuck in the past. So exiles are those parts that carry those memories from the past and painful memories. They overwhelm the system, leaving the individual feeling vulnerable, numbed, depleted of energy, and fragile. So just think about this amount of energy. Think about your own system when you experience perhaps rejection or shame. What's that feeling like? Perhaps that feeling was not unfamiliar to you. Maybe it was present in childhood. Exiles, physical sensations in the body. People often feel those in the chest or the stomach, the solar plexus chakra here. So just think about, again, that beach ball being pushed down and suppressed. They can also be experienced by feelings of depression, shame, pain, and emptiness. Now, you might be asking yourselves, like, how do these parts get exiled? And they get exiled through neglect, both in childhood and in adulthood. So you can have an exile part that is in your adulthood. Most of the time in clinical experience or my clinical experience, I've noticed that when clients have an adult exile part, underneath that exile part, there's a younger exile part. So that adult exile part might be protecting a younger exile part. They get exiled by attachment injuries in childhood, humiliation. You're not good enough, you know, boundary violation, chronic criticism, hostility, rejection, lack of attunement, overt, overt or covert traumas, big T and little t traumas. Now, I want you to take just some time to reflect on these questions. Have you ever been humiliated, shamed, punished, criticized, or judged for being playful, joyful, social, or even curious? What did you feel or come to believe about yourself or the world when that happened to you? How did your behavior or way of being change as a result of that? Now, maybe ask yourself and just write on a piece of paper right next to you, which parts of you became exiled as a result of these experiences? So, another example here is like when a child hears, "We are strong in this family," that's a big statement. And that will automatically exile that child's weak parts in families as well as in social settings, in cultural spaces. Criticism, neglect, abuse of power, oppression, lack of security, misattunement, and shaming lead to us exiling um, some parts. The strong need to fit in. Think about adolescence. Am I good enough to be part of this group of people in high school? Fitting in with a group may cause a person to exile the parts of them that seem out of place or that get rejected by others. Exiling is a protective adaptation to the external environment. To think about the messages that you've received during childhood from family figures, parents, adult figures. Um, Parts get exiled in social and cultural institutions all the time. And this happens at school, workplace, places of worship, actually, family, societal values and laws, and relationships of all kinds. So again, what are the goals to working with these parts? So first thing, you're always going to see that primary goal, self to part relationship. We want to help the exile increase trust in self. Once it's out and it's available, and you have enough self energy available, so now we can start introducing the self of the client to the exile part. And the exile part can then get to know the self of the client. We do that by witnessing, unburdening, helping the exile release the burdens. And you do that through healing steps, which we'll go over it in a different lecture. So that helps transform the exiles and relieve their protectors. So that brings the integration process, and they get to roles, choose a different space where they want to live within the system or outside of the system. And as long as we have enough self energy, we can provide that to our exile parts. One thing I really want to make clear is that work with exiles takes time, and you have to do it safely. Okay. So you should not work with exiles directly right off the bat, even though if they're fully present in showing everything that they want to show and tell you everything that they want to tell you right away. This is a common practitioner mistake. So we want to work first with managers and firefighters, protected parts. Once we get a contract, an agreement that it is okay to go to the exile, and that's when we proceed. How do the exiles show? And you probably have seen these as well in your own personal lives or with the people that you live with and friends and family members. They show as sensitive, vulnerable, innocent, intimacy, loving parts. They are very dependent, spontaneous, open, shamed, fearful, sad, frozen, fragile, hurt, lovable, abandoned, angry, powerless, sensitive, empty, hopeless, helpless, and worthless. Most of the time, they show up as young parts. Okay. Just want to read this quote here from Dick. And he says that when we banish young parts, we banish the curiosity, spontaneity, courage, and connectedness that that are given to us at birthright as a birthright. We cut ourselves from the gifts we were born with. In IFS, all parts have precious qualities, and they also have self energy. Exiles need to be brought out of isolation to have their stories told and understood. That concludes the parts and section. Now we're going to go over self and what that looks like. This is very important to know and to keep in mind that self is not a part. It is our true identity, the core. And I love this picture here because it truly shows and resembles, for me, what self looks like internally. For me, it I see it as just this ball of green energy that just leads and has all these great qualities. Self is always present since when we're born. Self is patient and wise. Self appreciates the importance of each part's role in what they do for the system. Self is accepting and feels compassion for the pain and burden each part may be carrying. It also has the ability to witness all parts with non-judgment. It's kind of like this very curious, open sensation within your body internally. Self is always willing to care for, to heal, and to protect all parts, no matter their job, what they do, how they do it. Self always welcomes all of our parts. These are the ACs, qualities of self. And I feel like one thing I really want to emphasize is that we can't always be in self. I mean, I still haven't met somebody that's walking 24/7 in self or being so self-led. So we all have parts. But if we're able to share at least a couple of these qualities and tap into some of these qualities, at least one or two, we're already embodying self-energy. So calmness, being centered and able to maintain a physical groundedness when you're facing stressful situations or when parts of you are taking over. Curiosity, being genuinely open and curious about why other parts or other people's parts are reacting. Be more curious instead of becoming upset with them or defensive with your own internal parts or with other people's parts. Compassion, seeing beyond others' angry or reactive or defensive parts, knowing that they also have a self, but they might not have access to some of these qualities yet, or they might not know how to access those qualities yet. Confidence, trusting that even if you made mistakes, there's no abiding knowledge that you do have your truest self inside of you, internally. And that truest self holds goodness and worth, and it can help you feel more grounded. Courage, standing up for injustices, speaking for. When you speak for your parts, you're embodying self, especially when you are overtaken by extreme parts. Clarity, maintaining a clear mind. Connectedness, feeling a sense of connection with all of your parts and other people's parts. And creativity, being free to be creative, embracing that creative space within you. On the other hand, we have the P's. So the 5 P's, I like to use these more when I'm in clinical spaces, but they don't have to just be used in clinical spaces. I mean, like if we're using 5 P's outside of our clinical spaces, wonderful. And that way we can combine it with the ACs. But for those of you who, might be in clinical spaces or not, that presence refers to the to your ability to be fully engaged and grounded in whatever practitioner processes that you're doing with somebody else. It involves being attuned to both your client's external presentation and their internal presentation. What's happening for them internally? Playfulness. It's this playful, safe environment that parts feel more comfortable being more or showing themselves as more spontaneous. When you're playful, you're embracing self energy, you're embracing those qualities of self. You're allowing your parts to just show up as playful. And that's beautiful. Patience is not just a virtue. Um, I would say that it's a main um, cornerstone to this work. Like when we're patient with our clients, with whomever is in front of us, we're more able to think more clearly, and we we can be more useful not only to ourselves internally, but for whomever is that we're working with. Persistence, commitment to dig deeper, and sharing your dedication to navigate many layers that people might be bringing into your space, and navigating those layers with them and not giving up on them. And perspective, encouraging clients to, again, adopt the same curious stance and compassionate stance that you're bringing into the space towards their own internal experiences. You can do this by guiding clients to explore different perspectives, and so they can gain more insight into the different dynamics that exist within them. Now, you hear me talk about this self and now self energy and the qualities of self. And self exists in everyone, like I said before, and we all have a self. Has different resonance than parts energy. So self is not reactive, is not um, preemptive, is not impulsive. Self is just open. So self energy is present at birth. We're born with it. Self needs parts for human development. Parts are resources for self, actually. All parts have self energy at their core. Think about a spider web, self being in the center, and your parts being on these other different um, tentacles or lines of the spider web. So self can transmit energy to our parts as well. Self feels like a center state of calmness, well-being, and lightheartedness. In IFS, we always ask, is your heart open to receiving this? And that's how you gauge whether your client or the person that you're practicing with is embodying self, or if there's a part that's coming up for them. That tells you right away. If they say yes, that might come from a part that's people pleasing you in that space, or it might come from self. And you continue to explore that with them. Distinguishing parts from self energy. This is very important. Parts have agendas, strategies to obtain certain things or outcomes. Self does not have an agenda, but it does have a desire to restore balance, harmony, connectedness, and healing. I want to read this quote so we can finish this part of the lecture. And the therapist's own self energy is essential for staying attuned to the client's parts, self, and the process. Your own self energy is essential in this process. Holding self energy in the therapist role helps clients' self energy to emerge. You can see how that can work in that space with your clients. If you're not holding enough self energy yourself, your clients are gonna pick up on that, and they might not be able to access their own self energy. It might be a counterproductive session or process. Before we continued, now to finish this part of the lecture, I just want to leave you with the goals of IFS. The overarching goals of IFS are to liberate parts from their extreme roles, to restore trust in self-leadership, to achieve balance, harmony, and wholeness, and to bring more self-energy to internal and external systems. These are some suggested readings. Again, the first book talks about internal family systems and just like an intro to IFS. I really like this book because, especially if you are somewhat like me or have parts that like illustration and images. Parts work by Tom Holmes, and these will be in the reference in the reference list at the end. Um, this one is if you're interested in working with children. This one is an IFS book in Spanish, eating disorder. And these two are the work training manuals. I find this very helpful, especially for beginner practitioners that like to have hands-on things like a hard copy of exercises and meditations. So these have a ton of meditation and exercises that you can do with your clients. So I will be sharing these at the end, but that concludes